Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 679 for February 4th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
To think one guy really makes all this stuff is not really true. We've got third generation people working in the plant, father-son teams, they've been at this for a long time. So, the operation of the equipment and knowledge of the plant and stuff, there's a huge amount of knowledge there.
Gordon Working heads up distilling at one of the busiest distilleries around, the MGP Ingredients Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. At one time, the old Seagram's distillery produced all of the component whiskeys for Seagram's 7 Crown. But over the years, it went through several owners until Kansas-based MGP bought it, just as contract distilling and the bourbon boom took hold. We'll have my conversation with Gordon Working later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with the calendar of events, your voice, and much more. It's all coming up on this week's WhiskyCast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique. But a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. If there's an end in sight to the American whiskey boom, it has not come yet. 2017 was another strong year for American whiskey sales, both in the U.S. and around the world. That's according to data released this week by the Distilled Spirits Council. Overall, domestic spirits sales grew by 4% during the year by revenue, but combined sales for bourbon, Tennessee, rye, and other American whiskeys grew by 8.1%, with most of that growth coming from bourbon and Tennessee whiskeys. Rye whiskey turned in another strong year with a 16% gain in sales, while sales of unaged corn and white whiskeys were down slightly. Canadian whiskeys remain the number 2 category in the U.S. market, up 2% for the year, while Irish whiskeys posted another 12.8% gain. Overall, Scotch whisky sales were up slightly, but as with all of the other categories, sales of high-end whiskeys showed solid gains, while sales of cheaper so-called value brands continue to fall. Distilled Spirits Council Chief Economist David Osgo says that's because consumers are willing to spend more money for what they see as premium products.
Back in 2007, value brands made up almost 40% of everything that was sold in the U.S. market. Premium was just under 36%, high-end premium was only 17.7%, and super premium was only 6.9%. Flash forward to 2017, and you see our volumes have really shifted over into the more expensive product categories.
On the global scene, whiskeys account for almost 70% of U.S. spirits exports by value, and that value cracked the billion-dollar mark for the first time in 2017. American whiskey exports grew 14%, with some of the gains coming as the U.S. dollar fell slightly against other global currencies. A weaker dollar makes U.S. exports more attractive, while making imported whiskeys slightly more expensive. For example, Great Britain is the number 2 export market for the U.S., while overall sales of Scotch whiskies fell here as the pound started to rise against the dollar. U.S. spirits exports to Great Britain grew almost 47%. Canada remains the number 1 export market for U.S. whiskeys, followed by Great Britain, Australia, Germany, and Spain. In other news this week, Glenmorangie is planning to break ground on an expansion of its distillery later this year. The project will include a second still house with 2 pairs of stills, along with another mash tun and washbacks. The project must still receive final approval from the Highland Council, but assuming that's approved, production with the new equipment could begin in 2019. No cost estimates for the expansion have been disclosed. The announcement came just as Glenmorangie released details on this year's private edition release. We had some of those details last time around, but Speos is different from many of the 8 previous private edition releases. Instead of being matured in a combination of casks, Speos is matured exclusively in ex-rye whiskey casks from Kentucky. It does not carry an age statement, but is bottled at 46% ABV and will carry a recommended retail price in the U.S. of $99 a bottle. Pricing will vary in other markets. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskeycast.com. Back in October, we reported on the latest Tullamore Dew release from Ireland. At the time, its Caribbean rum cask finish was an exclusive offering at Dublin's airport. Tullamore Dew's Tim Herlihy says it's received wider distribution around Ireland since then and is now coming to the U.S.
We're pretty thrilled to have it. It's been something that we've been enjoying in Ireland for a while now. It is classic Tullamore Dew in the fact that it's triple distilled, but it's made up of grain, malt, and pot still. And kind of what makes it a little bit different is we finish it for 4 to 6 months in Guyanan rum casks that really impart that rummy raisin note, bit of tropical fruits, toffee note to it. I'm just thrilled to have it on U.S. shores pretty soon.
And this was one that was originally available only in duty-free, right?
Correct. So it was one you'd only pick up on the way from Dublin Airport to wherever you may going, but we're excited to have it on U.S. shores just in time for St. Patrick's Day.
It'll be rolling out starting this week in some U.S. markets and will eventually be available throughout the U.S. No word yet on exports to other countries. And if you're heading to Canada, there's a rare Crown Royal expression that's only available through the LCBO in Ontario. Crown Royal's Stephen Wilson gave us some hints about Blenders Select.
Mark Balcanenda, one of our master blenders, he put together a blend of our coffee rye. So if you're familiar with the hand-selected barrel in the States, of course, the cool thing about this is actually a blend. So it's 2 different ages. We looked at a 2007 and a 2009 example of the coffee rye, and Mark went to work in partnership with the LCBO. So they were kind of tasting the samples along with him, giving their feedback. He was guiding them, and we created a really wonderful blend. And then Mark and I had the pleasure of launching that in Ontario.
Crown Royal Blenders Select went on sale quietly in Ontario at the end of November, but the LCBO still has it available. The price is $54.95 a bottle Canadian. That's about $44 U.S. One quick update from last week's news. During our story on the increases in visitor traffic at distilleries in Kentucky and Scotland and Ireland, we mentioned that Sazerac's Barton 1792 distillery in Bardstown had not yet announced its visitors center numbers for 2017. This week we got word from Sazerac that Barton 1792 had more than 33,000 visitors last year. That's up 13% from 2016. Along with that, Sazerac's A. Smith Bowman Distillery in Virginia had 24,000 visitors during 2016. That's a 10% increase. And finally, there's one offshoot out of last August's deal that split up San Francisco's Anchor Brewing and Distilling, with Japan's Sapporo Holdings acquiring the brewing assets, while Anchor's current owners, Tony Foglio and London's Berry Brothers and Rudd, are keeping what's been known since the deal as Anchor Distilling. That was only a short-term plan, at least for the name. The deal with Sapporo included the Anchor trademarks, and starting this week, the new name for the makers of Old Potrero Rye is Hodling & Company. The Hodling name has been used on some of the company's whiskies before and comes from A.P. Hodling, who was a well-known spirits dealer in San Francisco during the Gold Rush days. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskeycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. Look for Highland Park Full Volume at a whiskey shop near you. It takes Highland Park's flavor and cranks the volume all the way up to 11. You can get all the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
If you can't tell by now, my voice is not quite what it was last week, which wasn't what it usually is normally. I've been fighting the flu all week long, and I'm hoping to be back at full voice this time next week. In the meantime, let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. This tweet came in from Serkan Evrensel at Serkan E on Twitter, and it illustrates one of our principles perfectly. I know it is blended. I know it is not a single malt, but cheap and fine somehow. Sorry, I will not act like sophisticated and enjoy it. Valentine's 12? Just enjoy it. Serkan, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you find a whiskey you like and you want to stick with it, that's great. There's a whiskey out there for everyone. I shared that view on Twitter, and Whiskey Neighbor in Edmonton, Alberta, agreed with it, saying, always celebrate or stand behind your tastes, especially if you have found a great pour that is affordable. Now, earlier this week, in the middle of that flu bug, I asked for some help in finding a legitimate medicinal use for whiskey to help me fight off the virus. Got a bunch of hot toddy recipes that helped a little bit, but longtime listener and Turkish whiskey blogger Berke Adalig is also a doctor, and he tweeted this: "Get well soon. Sorry to inform you that there are no legit medicinal uses, parentheses, Berke as an MD, but a hot toddy always works, parentheses, Berke as a whiskey writer." Thanks, Berke. And by the way, you can listen to my interview with Berke about whiskey blogging in Turkey from last October in episode 661. It's in the archives at whiskeycast.com. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskeycast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And you can email us at comments@whiskeycast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, and it's brought to you this week by Heaven Hill Distillery. If you're in the Chicago area, there's a Glendronach Original by Design tasting coming up on Tuesday night, and a Benriach See Both Sides tasting Wednesday night. The Whiskey, Wine, and Wildlife Weekend is this coming weekend in Jekyll Island, Georgia. Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort and Woodford Reserve Distillery in Versailles, Kentucky both have Valentine's Day dinners on February 10th, and Woodford has one on the 14th as well. The Winnipeg Whiskey Festival is February 15th in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Whiskey Social is February 21st at Starward Distillery in Melbourne, Australia. And the Go Whiskey Weekend is February 23rd through the 25th at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts. Right now, we have 182 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskeycast.com. And this week, the calendar is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Whiskey Advocate's 2017 Whiskey of the Year, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. The 12-year-old barrel proof bourbon was pitted blind against competition from around the globe and was consistently ranked number one by the magazine's testers. Meet the whole Elijah Craig family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely.
You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. But when you have a special occasion, why not celebrate with a specially engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label? Here's how one whiskey lover celebrated his team's recent success. He arranged to have 108 specially engraved bottles of Johnnie Walker Blue Label made for his co-workers. You might say he hit a home run. Just like a perfectly executed double play, Johnnie Walker Blue Label is smooth and well-rounded, and unlike a trophy, never needs polishing. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Johnnie Walker Blue Label blended Scotch Whisky, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. For entrepreneurs looking to create a new whiskey brand, or longtime distillers who need to source a style of whiskey they can't produce in their own distilleries, the first place they usually look to is Lawrenceburg, Indiana. It's just north of the Ohio River and west of Cincinnati, and the MGP Ingredients Distillery is Lawrenceburg's biggest business. It's been around for decades and was known for most of that time as the Seagram's Distillery. After the Seagram's empire was broken up and assets sold off to various companies, the distillery went through several owners and switched to focusing on contract distilling for clients. MGP bought the place in 2011, just as the market for American whiskey was starting to take off. Gordon Working is one of MGP's head distillers in Lawrenceburg, and I sat down with him recently for a chat.
You guys have probably the most misunderstood distillery around in terms of, as we were talking before, people like to gripe about non-distiller producers using MGP stock, but the base whiskey is really, really good. It's just a question of what happens to it after it leaves your plant. Tell me about the whole distillery there, because it's been around for decades and decades.
Yeah, it was, I think, Rossville Distillery initially, and then it becomes Seagram's, and then it was Pernod, and then it was LDI, and now it's us. So we've gone through a number of owners through the year, but it's been since 1857, I think, is when Seagram's first picked it up. So old distillery. So, yeah, most of the stuff that people buy, a lot of it is, we make it for them, but, they'll come and they'll go through a panel, and say, well, we like, about this much rye and we like this flavor profile. So really it's their product, they're telling us, what they do. Sometimes they bring their own yeast, sometimes they bring their own grain, sometimes they bring their own barrels. So, people are picking up things, but we're really making it for them. So, every one is a little different.
So it's not just that standard 95.5 rye that we know about from MGP.
We make a whole bunch of that, but a lot of people want different stuff. They'll buy two and with their intention of blending them. But we make a lot of 21%, 36%, 95. So that's our predominant mash bills. But we have like 19 that we make. So
now you've been there a long time, right?
Been with MGP for about 12 years now. So
how'd you get your start there?
Actually, I've been in the industry, alcohol industry, probably 40 years. Mostly fuel, and then it was industrial, then it was vodkas, and now it's into brown goods. But I worked for Abengoa Bioenergy. They're probably the world's biggest fuel producer at one point, and I managed 6 plants, 3 in Spain and 3 in the U.S. And then the CEO of the U.S. division of the Spain company was Tim Newkirk. And he quit and went back to MGP. That's his hometown. That's actually where he grew up. And when he went back, he brought me back with him. So I ended up at MGP due to Tim Newkirk.
But you wound up in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and he's out in Topeka, Kansas, right?
Well, he's now moved on to something else. We got a new CEO, Gus. Gus Griffin. So yeah. So Tim's gone. He's been gone probably 5 years, 6 years now. But I stayed on.
And you're glad he didn't take you with him this time?
Yeah, I've actually liked it. It's been a nice progression through the career, now into brown goods. So I've done a lot of distillation design and stuff, so I sort of bring some stuff to the table. But there's a lot of knowledge in that plant. I mean, to think one guy really makes all this stuff is not really true. We've got third generations people working in the plant, father-son teams, they've been at this for a long time. So, the operation of the equipment and knowledge of the plant and stuff, there's a huge amount of knowledge there. So,
one of the questions I get a lot from listeners is the difference between distilling for whiskey and spirits and distilling for fuel-grade alcohol and fuel-grade ethanol. What's the difference?
Okay, fuel grade is you just want to strip everything out of the beer, concentrate it to 200 proof. So it has fusel oils, heads, everything in it, and you dehydrate it to 200 proof, and that's used for fuel. Industrial grade then is you want all those impurities out. So we go through a 4 or 5 column system where you take all the heads, fusel oils, everything out, and it's basically a purity race at this point. Most people selling industrial, you're down in the 2 to 3 to 5 ppm type total impurities. It's really pure stuff. And then whiskey is you want some of those things in and some not. So it's a real simple one. It's a beer still stripper and then a second doubler to get your cut. So it's quite a bit simpler to do whiskey than either of the other two. So.
And grain neutral spirits, or GNS, is somewhere in between, right?
Well, GNS is all the stuff. That's industrial vodka, all that. But yeah, that's the 4 or 5 column system, and that's a big investment for someone wanting to get into that. So people that make it, in their little plants, they'll do it 6, 7, 8 times, and it still isn't very good. So you just can't get the purity without the correct equipment. So
how many different mash bills do you guys make in a year?
Well, I don't know how many we've made this year, but I think on our recipe sheets, I think we have close to 19 of them. So,
let's say that I wanted to start a whiskey brand, and I come to you guys and your sales guys. Walk me through the process for going through to buy my whiskey from MGP.
To buy aged stuff, or to
both. Let's go both.
Raw distillate. Well, raw distillate is, they'll come in and a lot of times they go to our quality lab first and they'll say, I'm looking for something, I sort of like, this type of thing. So how do I match that or whatever? So they'll look at, the different mash bills. We'll blend them all up, give them, panels. They say, well, I like that, I don't like that or whatever. And then you sort of narrow it down to what they're looking for. And then again, some of them say, well, I want something very specific and I want to use my yeast or I want to use my barrels. And so that's the whole process of going through. And then new distillate, when it comes off, we barrel it. And most of it ends up in barrels in our warehouse. We store it for them. Some goes out as raw distillate. We send it out in bulk. So some buy it and barrel it themselves. But most of it is barreled on site. So.
And then let's go through the process if I want aged stock, because you sell aged whiskeys too, right?
Yeah, that's it's really what you're looking for at that point. You don't really have much say-so in what it is. You just come and you'll do the panel and you say, well, I like that or not like that. And so we're starting to sell some aged stuff now. Actually, 1 and 2-year-olds been picking up. So.
And then when people buy it, they can leave it there and let it mature a little longer if they wanted to, right?
Yeah, they can. So.
But you guys have started making your own stuff now with George Remus and making your own brand too, right?
Yeah, we have actually another vodka. It's called Till. It's out of our Atchison facility. It's a vodka under our name now. And then Remus, and we're coming out with a Repeal.
Is there any difference between distilling for yourselves and what you guys pick and what you make available to the customer base?
No, not really. The quality of the operations is really what drives it. You can change mash bills or really what you want, what barrel or proof you put it in a barrel. There's some variables, but, the quality of the process is still the same, so. Yeah, we don't make good stuff for us and sell the crap to everybody else. So that's definitely not the case. So
you keep the crap for yourselves and sell the good stuff, right?
No, we just make good stuff. We don't make any crap.
And thanks to Gordon Working for spending some time with us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin. Look for the Lagavulin 8 and 16-year-old single malts, along with the Sherry Cask Finished Distillers Edition at a whiskey shop near you. And visit malts.com for more information. Since I've been sick all week long and unable to taste any whiskeys, the What I'm Tasting This Week department is taking the week off too. It'll be back next time around, but in the meantime, you can search through my tasting notes for nearly 2,100 whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find the latest episode of WhiskyCast Virtual Tastings with our panel recorded at the recent Victoria Whiskey Festival. It's brought to you by the Whiskey Exchange. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, events, and much more at whiskycast.com, along with a complete archive of past episodes. And join us this week on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique. But a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnnywalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.